Welcome to Bernette's Bizarre but True Tales. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the show.
Welcome, brave souls, to Bernette's Bizarre but True Tales, where the floorboards of history creak beneath our feet. Folklore waits in the corners, and the truth has a habit of breathing when the room goes still. Tonight, I ask you to lower the lights, draw the curtains, and listen closely. If something knocks from the dark while I am speaking, do not answer it. Not yet, because this tale was never meant for the faint of heart. Listen, if you dare. Picture me there, alone on Charles Street, after midnight, where New Orleans stops performing for the tourists and starts whispering to the dead. The music has thinned into the distance. The river is somewhere beyond the darkness, breathing against the levee. And before me stands the Old Ursuline Convent, severe, silent, and watching, as if every brick remembers something it has been ordered never to tell. I look up at the third floor, at the attic windows and sealed shutters that have helped make this building one of the most haunted landmarks in the city. Officially, those shutters can be explained by architecture preservation and the practical demands of an old building. But New Orleans has never been satisfied with only one explanation. The city also tells another story, a story of young women from France, small wooden boxes, empty trunks, blessed nails, and the birth of one of America's oldest vampire legends. Tonight, I am opening the file on all of it, the documented history, the colonial politics, the ocean crossing, the Ursuline nuns, the strange little boxes, the Mobile and Biloxi connections, the sealed attic, the vampire whispers, and the question that has refused to die for nearly 3 centuries. This is not just a story. This is a door. And once we open it, we may not be able to close it again. I want to treat this like a cold case file, not because I can prove vampires walk through the French Quarter, and not because every whispered detail belongs in the archive. I am treating it like a case because the pattern is familiar. Vulnerable young women transported by authority, a frightened settlement hungry for explanation, unexplained illness, missing bodies in the story's retelling, sealed rooms, inconsistent accounts, and a physical location that still functions like evidence. In true crime terms, the scene was never really cleared. In paranormal terms, it was never really closed. But it is not what survived outside the convent that brings us here tonight. It is what they locked inside. If you tilt your head back and look up at the third floor, the steeply pitched attic under the roof line, you will notice something unsettling. Every single window on the lower floors is open or shuttered normally to catch the river breeze. But the windows of the third floor, the small half-dormers that peer out like dead eyes, are completely permanently sealed shut. The heavy wooden shutters are nailed into the frames. Legend says they were secured with iron nails blessed by the church. For 300 years, those windows have never been opened. The attic is a tomb of dead air, pitch black darkness, and dry heat. Even to this day, those windows have never been opened. If you ask the official historians, they will tell you the windows are sealed to protect the building's structural integrity or preserve historical artifacts. But if you ask the streets, They will tell you about the girls who arrived in December of 1728. They will tell you about the luggage they brought with them, and they will tell you about the night the wood began to splinter from the inside out. So take a breath, stay close, and whatever you do, do not look too long at the windows. Tonight, we descend into the terrifying, shadowed history of the Casket Girls of New Orleans. Every good investigation starts with two columns: what can be documented and what people insist they saw. Tonight, I am keeping both columns open. On one side are ships' migration policies, convent records, disease, and colonial desperation. On the other are sealed shutters, nocturnal figures, empty trunks, drained victims, and the stubborn question that keeps folklore alive. Why does this story still feel like a warning? To understand the horror of what happened in the attic, we have to look at what New Orleans was in the early 1720s. Forget the beautiful balconies and the fine dining. In its infancy, New York was a miserable, swampy outpost, a collection of muddy ditches, malaria-carrying mosquitoes, and temporary wooden shacks sinking into the delta mud. The French crown had a massive problem. They had established this colony, but it was populated almost entirely by male soldiers, fur trappers, gold seekers, and criminals. Jean-Baptiste Lemoyne, the founder of the city, wrote desperate letters back to King Louis. He said his men were wild, lawless, and refusing to build permanent homes or clear the land. They spent their days drinking, gambling, and disappearing into the woods. He knew that to tame a colony, you needed families. To build families, you need wives. The king's first solution was brutal. In 1721, the French government literally emptied out the prisons, the poorhouses, and the brothels of Paris. They rounded up hundreds of women, debtors, thieves, and prostitutes, chained them together, and marched them to the port cities, and they were packed onto ships like cattle. These women were known as the correction girls. When they arrived in the mud of New Orleans, it was a disaster. Many died on the voyage from scurvy and filth. The ones who survived were hardened, angry, and utterly unwilling to be submissive, colonial housewives. In fact, when a group of them learned they were being exiled to the swamp, they staged a violent mutiny at the French port. 7 of them were shot dead on the docks before the ship even left. The experiment failed. The priests in the colony complained bitterly that these women were bringing ruin and vice to the new land. So the crown pivoted. They needed pure women, virtuous women, innocent girls who could be molded into the matriarchs of a new empire. They turned to the convents and orphanages of France. They looked for young girls, mostly teenagers between 14 and 19, who had no families, no dowries, and no future in Europe. They promised them a grand adventure. They promised them that across the Atlantic, a rich husband, a beautiful plot of land, and a life of status awaited them. They were called the Filles et la Cassette, meaning the Casket Girls. But language has a way of twisting in the dark, and in the mouths of terrified colonists, Casket would soon become Casket. And this policy did not begin with Louisiana. France had already used the model in the 17th century, sending young women known as the king's daughters to colonies such as Canada, Louisiana, and the French West Indies. Later, the same imperial logic hardened into something crueler. Correction girls, women pulled from the streets of Paris, poorhouses, prisons, houses of correction, and sometimes sent along with debtors' husbands. By 1719, more than 200 convicted women were deported to Louisiana. The contrast mattered. Against that reputation, the Casket Girls were presented as respectable, poor but virtuous, recruited from church charitable institutions, orphanages, and convents, and promoted as suitable wives for the colonial settlement. That distinction eventually became a point of pride on the Gulf Coast. Families would later claim descent from the Casket Girls rather than from the Correction Girls, because the Casket Girls carried a social meaning, legitimacy, Catholic respectability, and the founding of Creole lineages. Whether every claim stands up to the archive is another matter, but the desire to claim them tells us how powerful their symbolic role became. The story also reaches further back than New Orleans. The first Casket Girls associated with the Gulf Coast reached Mobile in 1704, Biloxi in 1719, and then New Orleans in 1728. The Mobile group became known as the Pelican Girls because they sailed from France aboard the ship La Pelican. They arrived first at Massacre Island, later called Dolphin Island, then traveled by shadow draft boats through Mobile toward 27-Mile Bluff. Their voyage carries illness with it. After a stop in Cuba, yellow fever infected crew and passengers alike. 2 of the young women died soon after arrival, and the epidemic spread through the fort, even taking the life of adventurer Henry de Tonney. Most of those Mobile women were between 14 and 19, and despite disease, many married within a month. But marriage did not mean obedience. When their new husbands spent too much time in the woods and too little time building homes, planting gardens, or providing food and shelter, the women staged what became known as the Petticoat Rebellion. They refused bed and board until the men provided a roof and food. In that moment, the women were not passive cargo. They were negotiators, survivors, and young people demanding the basic conditions of life. In the spring of 1728, the chosen girls boarded a ship bound for a world most of them had only heard about in promises. France called it opportunity. The church called it duty. The crown called it settlement. But for those girls stepping onto the deck, clutching their little wooden boxes, it must have felt like exile dressed in Sunday clothes. It took 5 months at sea in the belly of an 18th century wooden sailing vessel. The dampness rots their clothes. The fresh water turns green and slimy with algae within weeks. The hard-tack biscuits are alive with weevils. Then came the disease, yellow fever, scurvy. The ship became a floating hospital, and then a floating morgue. The girls watched their companions burn with fever, their skin turning a sickly jaundice yellow before vomiting black blood and dying in the dark. The bodies were wrapped in canvas and slid over the rail into the gray Atlantic. Day after day, the surviving girls sat in the claustrophobic hold, listening to the wood groan, staring at the small, uniform wooden boxes the king had given each of them to hold their earthly possessions. The boxes were rectangular, long, made of dark wood with iron clasps. To a superstitious sailor staring through the dim lantern light of the cargo hold, those boxes didn't look like clothing trunks. They looked exactly like child-sized coffins. In December 1728, at last, the ship slid into the muddy mouth of the Mississippi and crawled towards New Orleans like something wounded returning from sea. The colonists, desperate for a glimpse of their future wives, gathered on the levee. The men are dressed in their finest rags, waiting for the beautiful, blushing French maidens they had been promised. The gangplank lowers, but the women who walk down onto the muddy soil do not look like brides. They look like corpses. The 5-month nightmare at the sea had transformed them. Their skin was translucent, a ghostly, chalky white from months spent in total darkness beneath the deck. Their eyes were sunken, surrounded by deep, dark purple shadows. Because of the ravages of scurvy, their gums were swollen and bleeding, exposing elongate, red-stained teeth. They walked with a slow, unsteady, halting gait, shivering violently despite the thick Louisiana heat. And behind each girl, carried by portage laborers or dragged by the girls themselves, came the trunks. 88 identical dark wooden boxes. The crowd on the levee fell utterly silent. No one cheered. No one ran forward to greet them. The colonists backed away, crossing themselves. A whisper rippled through the muddy streets. They didn't bring us wives. They brought us the dead. Because the colony was still a wild, dangerous place full of desperate men, the girls could not simply be handed over. They needed protection. The crown had arranged for a small group of Ursuline nuns who had arrived the year before to take custody of the girls. The nuns marched the pale, silent teenagers through the French Quarter to the temporary convent facility. Each girl carried or watched over their box. The townspeople watched from their windows. They noticed that the girls didn't look at the men. They kept their heads down, their eyes fixed on the muddy earth, their lips moving in silent, rhythmic whispers that didn't sound like prayers. And that night, the whispers in the taverns grew teeth. People pointed out that during the entire unloading process, under the blazing midday sun, not one of those girls had looked up into the light. They had shielded their pale eyes with their hands, weeping as if the sun itself was burning them. Then the rumors began that very night. The trunks weren't filled with lace or dresses and wedding veils. They were filled with the soil of the old world, the dead soil of French graveyards, and something else was hiding beneath that dirt. If this were a police file, this is where the incident reports will begin to stack up. First, witnesses on the levee describing the same pale arrivals. Second, tavern rumors that spread before anyone had time to verify them. Third, a pattern of illness that colonial medicine could not explain cleanly. And finally, the detail that makes every investigator lean forward. The same detail repeated again and again in different forms. The boxes, always the boxes. The Casket Girls were taken to the 3rd floor of the convent, the attic beneath the steep roofline, high above the street, far from the hands and appetites of the town. The nuns believed they had placed the girls somewhere safe, but safety and confinement sometimes wear the same face. The nuns lined the room with 88 small iron cuts, and at the foot of every single cut, sat one of those dark rectangular wooden trunks. The rules were strict. The girls were kept under lock and key. They were only allowed out during the day under the heavy chaperone to meet prospective suitors, to learn embroidery, and to pray. But the courtships did not go well. The men who tried to speak with the Casket Girls reported a chilly coldness. The girls spoke in a strange, archaic French dialect that even the colonists struggled to understand. They refused to eat the local food, the corn, the wild game, the seafood. They grew thinner and thinner. Their skin became so paper thin that the blue veins beneath looked like spiderwebs spreading across their throats and wrists. And then the nights began. Then the neighbors began to talk. At first, only in whispers over candlelight. They said that when the midnight bells tolled, the entire quarter changed. Dogs stopped barking. Cicadas went silent. Even the river seemed to hold its breath. Then they would hear it, the sound of the third floor. Dormer windows creaking open. People looking out from their porches reported seeing pale, slender figures slipping out of the high windows, moving with impossible grace down the steep slate roof and vanishing into the shadows of the alleyways. Within weeks of their arrival, a wave of mysterious illnesses struck the French Quarter. It wasn't like the yellow fever the colonists were used to. This was different. People, mostly young men, would wake up in the morning completely drained of energy, their faces as white as sheets, unable to rise from their beds. When the doctors examined them, they found no fever, no rash, no congestion, just two small, dark, inflamed puncture wounds on the side of the neck or on the inside of the wrist. Many of these young men died within days, their hearts simply stopping because they had no blood left in their bodies. The panic reached a boiling point. The townspeople formed a militia and marched to the gates of the Ursuline Convent, demanding that the nuns turn over the girls. They believed the girls were demons or vampires, a word that was just beginning to bleed out of the Eastern European folklore into the global consciousness. The Mother Superior refused to let them in. She insisted the girls were innocent orphans under the protection of the Holy Church. But behind closed doors, even the nuns were starting to break. The sister assigned to watch over the third floor dormitory at night reported terrifying occurrences in her journal. She wrote that she would wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of scratching, not mice, the sound of human fingernails dragging across the inside lids of the wooden trunks. One night, the sister took her lantern and walked through the rows of cuts while the girls slept. She reached the end of the room where the spare, unused trunks were stored. She decided to open one. She turned the iron latch and lifted the heavy wooden lid. The trunk was completely empty. No clothes, no sheets, no dowry. And when she pressed her hand against the bottom of the box, the wood was burning hot, and the interior smelled of fresh, iron-rich blood and wet earth. She turned around terrified and realized that every single one of the 88 girls was awake. They were all sitting upright in their cots, their eyes wide, staring at her in absolute, synchronized silence in the dark. And here is the part of the story I cannot shake. The sister does not scream at first. She cannot, because in that moment there is no movement, no attack, no chase down the staircase. There is only the lantern flame trembling in her hand, the hot, empty trunk at her feet, and 88 girls sitting upright in the darkness as if they had been waiting for her to understand. Then one of the trunks behind her gives a slow, deliberate knock from the inside. The third floor accounts follow a pattern investigators still recognize. Environmental silence before activity, repeated sounds from inside sealed objects. Witnesses reported movement at the impossible heights, and an object, the trunk, that acts almost like a trigger. Whether we call it haunting, mass panic, illness, or storytelling under pressure, the structure is the same. The convent becomes a containment site. The attic becomes the locked room.
Seal the windows
and the girls
now.
become both suspects and victims in a mystery no one can solve without turning them into monsters. If I were walking this scene as an investigator, I would mark the recurring claims in red ink. Sudden temperature drops in a sealed, heat-trapped attic, scratching heard from inside wooden trunks, witnesses describing figures at the dormer windows after the room was supposedly locked, reports of bloodless weakness among young men, the smell of wet earth and copper inside an empty box, and the most disturbing pattern of all, activity that appears to center on thresholds, windows, lids, doors, and locks. That is what makes the legend feel less like a simple ghost story and more like a containment failure. The girls are not only seen, they are heard pressing against barriers. The trunks do not merely sit in the room. They breathe, heat, scrape, and answer when touched. The attic is not just the bedroom. It behaves like a locked cell with something inside trying to learn the shape of the lock. By 1730, fear had become the loudest voice in the colony. The whispers had climbed from tavern corners to church steps, from church steps to the governor's door. And when authority finally moved, it moved not like justice, but like panic wearing a uniform. The nuns were relieved. They prepared to clear out the third floor. On the morning the girls were scheduled to be moved to the docks, the Mother Superior and 3 sisters ascended the narrow wooden staircase to the attic. The heavy oak door was locked from the outside, just as it was every night. The Mother Superior turned the heavy iron key. The lock clicked. She pushed the door open. The room was ice cold despite the sweltering Louisiana morning. The attic was completely empty. All 88 cots were stripped bare. The sheets were gone. The girls were gone. And the trunks? The 88 dark wooden boxes, they were still there, arranged in a perfect, unbroken circle in the center of the room. The nuns rushed to the windows. The small dormer windows were shuttered outward. Glass sprayed across the slate tiles of the roof below. There was no way 88 women could have slipped through those tiny openings and vanished into a crowded city undetected. But they were gone, completely. Not a single trace of the Casket Girls were ever found in Louisiana again. They didn't board the ship. They weren't hiding in the swamps. They simply evaporated into the humid air. Terrified that the spirits or monsters would return to claim their property, the Mother Superior ordered the convent's workmen to take heavy cypress boards and nail the third floor windows shut. They used iron nails that had been soaked in holy water and blessed by the resident priests. The door to the attic was chained and locked. It was declared holy ground, forbidden to be trodden by human feet. For nearly 3 centuries, that room remained sealed until 1978. Now the case jumps centuries, and this is where I slow down. because the modern episode has the texture of a true crime legend. Unnamed investigators, missing or sealed records, emergency calls no one can produce on demand, and a death scene that sounds almost too cinematic to be real. That does not mean it belongs in the verified column. It means it belongs in the folklore column with a red flag beside it. But red flags are not useless. They tell us where the community wanted the fair to go. Then the legend leaps forward. Late 1970 New Orleans, two amateur paranormal investigators became obsessed with the sealed attic. They did not want the polite museum answer. They did not want the folklore wrapped in a souvenir brochure. They wanted proof, and proof in stories like this had a terrible habit of asking for payment. Through bribery or stealth, the details remain murky, but the two men managed to slip past the convent security late one October night. They carried cameras, audio recorders, and a duffel bag of tools. They made their way to the back staircase, cut through the ancient rusted chains on the attic door, and stepped into the forbidden third floor for the first time in 250 years. What happened next is reconstructed from the frantic, borderline, wonderful emergency calls received by the New Orleans Police Department at 3:14 a.m. The dispatcher received a call from a man screaming so loudly his voice cracked into a horrific shriek. He kept repeating, "The boxes were breathing." He said his friend was gone, that something had pulled him into the darkness under the rafters. When the police arrived at the Old Ursuline Convent, they found the courtyard gates locked. But as they walked around the perimeter of the stone wall on Charles Street, they looked up. For the first time since 1730, one of the sealed third-floor shutters had been violently kicked open from the inside. The officers shone their heavy flashlights up at the open window. Sitting on the edge of the roof, looking down at them, were the two investigators, or rather, what was left of them. Both men were completely dead. Their bodies had been entirely decapitated. Their heads were nowhere to be found. But what terrified the responding officers most was the blood, for there weren't any. The necks of the two men had been cleanly severed, but their bodies were completely white, dry, and entirely devoid of a single drop of blood. It was as if their circulatory system had been vacuumed clean. And on the street below, directly beneath the open window, the police found the investigators' recording equipment smashed to pieces on the cobblestone. The state police confiscated the remains of the equipment. The church immediately hired contractors to reseal the windows. The shutters were nailed shut once more, this time reinforced with steel brackets. The official police report listed the death as an unsolved homicide, likely committed by vagrants or occultists hiding in the building. The files were quickly classified and buried in the archives. But the contractors who fixed the windows that night whispered a different story. They said that when they hammered the new nails into the ancient wood, a thick, dark, red liquid began to seep out of the nail holes. It didn't look like sap. It didn't smell like pine. It smelled like copper. It smelled like life. Unverified, no clean public paper trail settles the modern death story in the way a true crime investigator would require. But in paranormal storytelling, absence often becomes part of the charge. Missing files, unnamed witnesses, sealed rooms, and official silence are the oxygen legends breathe. The responsible conclusion is not this happened exactly as told. The responsible conclusion is stranger. People needed this story badly enough to keep retelling it as if the building itself were withholding testimony. Later tellings of the incident add details that read like field notes from a failed investigation. Batteries draining within minutes, camera film fogged white, recording tapes warped by a low pulsing hum, fresh scratches appearing on the inner side of the shutter lens, and a voice on the broken audio repeating one phrase in French. Open. None of these details can be treated as verified evidence, but as folklore, they sharpen the same theme again and again. Something inside wants access to the world outside, and every generation invents a new device to hear it. So when I picture those investigators in 1978, I do not picture them charging in bravely. I picture the beam of a flashlight thinning in the dust. I picture the recorder picking up not a scream, but a whisper too close to the microphone. I picture one man turning because he hears his own name spoken from inside a trunk that should be empty, and I picture the other reaching for the door only to find that the chain they cut on the way in is somehow back across the frame. Today, the Old Ursuline Convent stands as a museum. You can walk through its gardens. You can admire the paintings and the sacred objects. You can stand inside history and feel perfectly safe so long as you stay where the doesn't allow you to stand. But you cannot go to the third floor. If you ask the tour guides about the Casket Girls, they will smile politely. They will give you the historical explanation. They will tell you that cassette just meant a small suitcase. They will tell you the girls were the founding mothers of the city's finest Creole families. They will tell you vampire stories are just folklore, a myth created to scare tourists or popularized by the modern Gothic fiction writers. They will tell you there is nothing to be afraid of here. And this is where I must make the distinction clearly. The archive is complicated. Some historians argue that the record for the Casket Girls in Louisiana is thin, and that parts of the Ursuline connection may have grown through repetition rather than documentation. Others point out that Creole ancestry itself was far more complex than later families. Legends admit it, shaped from the beginning by the Europeans, Native Americans, Africans, and people of mixed ancestry. So when I tell this story, I am not asking you to accept every Gothic detail as fact. I am asking you to listen to how fact became family pride, how family pride became legend, and how legend became horror. So my final verdict is split. As history, the Casket Girls show us colonial control, gendered vulnerability, migration disease, and the making of Creole identity. As a paranormal case, they show us how a location becomes charged, a convent, an attic, shutters, nails, trunks, and silence. And as true crime, they ask a harder question. Not who killed whom, but who gets transformed into the monster when the society needs someone to blame. But as you leave the museum and walk back out into Charles Street, I want you to do something. I want you to pause on the sidewalk. I want you to turn around and look up at the small blue-gray dormer windows nestled into the steep slate roof. Look closely at the heavy wooden shutters nailed tightly to the stone and ask yourself, If there's nothing up there, why are the nails still holding them in? Because the most frightening evidence in this case is not a body, a photograph, or a confession. It is restraint. It is the fact that the story keeps returning to restraints. Blasted nails, sealed shutters, locked doors, chained attics, forbidden stairs. In every version, someone is trying to keep something in, and every version ends with the same fear. Wood rots, iron weakens, and old rocks do not hold forever. And what happens if they ever rusted away? So here's where I leave the file open. Not on a desk, not in an archive, but beneath those sealed shutters, where history and horror crush their hands against the same pane of glass. Maybe the Casket Girls were only frightened children caught inside a brutal colonial machine. Maybe the vampire story is nothing more than sickness fear, misogyny, and a city's appetite for the macabre. But legends do not survive for 3 centuries because they are harmless. They survive because something in them keeps knocking. And in New Orleans, where the dead are buried above ground and the past never stays buried at all, I cannot help wondering whether the question was never what came out of those boxes. Maybe the real question is what is still waiting to be let out. If this tale sent a chill down your spine, don't keep it locked away in the attic. Share this episode with someone brave enough to listen after dark. Subscribe to Bernette's Bizarre but True Tales and leave a comment telling me what you believe. Were the Casket Girls innocent, young women swallowed by history, or was something darker sealed behind those shutters? And if you want more bizarre, haunted, and true tales from the shadows of the past, make sure you follow the show, because next time we'll open another door that maybe should have stayed closed. And before I let you go, keep one candle burning for our next tale. We are staying in New Orleans, but this time we step away from the sealed convent shutters and into the elegant darkness of Royale Street, where a mysterious aristocrat named Jacques Saint-Germain appeared in the early 20th century. He hosted lavish dinner parties, spoke of centuries past as if he had lived them, was said never to eat with his guests, and vanished after a woman claimed he attacked her and bit her neck. When police searched his home, legend says they found wine bottles filled not with wine, but with blood. Was Jacques merely a dangerous man hiding behind charm, or was he connected to the immortal cult of Saint-Germain himself? Next time on Bernette's Bizarre but True Tales, we open the file on the vampire of Royal Street. Listen if you dare. Thank you for spending this dark little corner of the night with me, and for joining me inside another strange chapter of history, where truth and legend refuse to stay apart. Your time, your curiosity, and your courage to listen mean the world to me. Until our next bizarre but true tale, keep your candles burning, keep your doors locked, and never ignore a knock from somewhere no one should be. This has been Bernette's Bizarre but True Tales. Sleep out if you can, and remember, some stories are buried for a reason.